Within the first 200 milliseconds of seeing a face, your brain has already made a series of judgments about the person attached to it. Not impressions that will be revised as you gather more information. Not hunches that will fade once you actually speak. Decisions about trustworthiness, competence, dominance, warmth, and threat level that will shape how you treat that person, what you expect from them, and how you remember the entire interaction, often for years. This happens before you have heard a single word, before you have registered the color of their clothes or the expression on their face, before any part of you has consciously decided to pay attention at all. And the research is clear. These snap judgments are not random noise. They are precise, fast, and remarkably persistent. Understanding how they form and what they actually predict will change the way you see every first encounter you have ever had, including the ones where you are the stranger being judged. The scientific framework that best explains this process is called thin slicing. The term was coined by psychologist Nalini Ambady, who discovered that humans can make surprisingly accurate predictions about people and outcomes from very short exposures to behavior. Exposures so brief that conscious deliberation has no time to begin. In one of her most striking studies, Ambady asked participants to watch 30-second silent video clips of college professors teaching. From those clips alone, with no audio and no content, participants were asked to rate the professors on dimensions like confidence, warmth, and enthusiasm. The ratings produced from those 30 seconds correlated significantly with the end-of-semester student evaluations completed by students who had spent an entire semester in those professors' classes. 2 seconds of silent footage produced ratings that were nearly as predictive as the full 30 seconds. The system doing this evaluation is not slow and deliberate. It is ancient, rapid, and operating almost entirely outside awareness. This rapid judgment system evolved for good reasons. For most of human evolutionary history, reading strangers quickly was a survival skill. The question of whether an approaching person was friend or threat needed an answer in fractions of a second, not the minutes it would take to conduct a proper social interview. The brain regions involved in this rapid processing, particularly the amygdala, are phylogenetically ancient. They predate language, deliberation, and most of what we consider conscious thought. The problem is that a system calibrated for predatory threats in small ancestral groups is now running in offices, job interviews, first dates, and political elections, producing automatic verdicts on strangers in a world far more complex than the one it was built for. Psychologist Alexander Todorov at Princeton has studied the specific judgments people make from faces with extraordinary precision. In one series of experiments, participants were shown pairs of unfamiliar faces for just 1 second and asked to choose which person looked more competent. When those pairs turned out to be actual candidates in gubernatorial and Senate elections in the United States, the competence ratings predicted the winners in roughly 70% of the races. 1 second, no names, no policies, no track records, just faces and the snap judgments attached to them. Todorov is careful to note that these judgments are not accurate assessments of actual competence. They are assessments of a signal that the brain uses as a proxy for competence, and that proxy can be dramatically wrong. But the finding has a disturbing implication. The visual signal that activates a first impression is influencing real electoral outcomes at significant scale. The persistence of first impressions is one of their most consequential features. Psychologists call this the primacy effect, the well-established finding that the information we encounter first carries disproportionate weight in how we form an overall evaluation. When a first impression is positive, subsequent information tends to be interpreted in a way that is consistent with it. When a first impression is negative, subsequent information tends to be either filtered out or reinterpreted to fit the initial verdict. This is not stubbornness or irrationality in any simple sense. It is the way the brain economizes on cognitive resources. Once a model of a person has been built, it is metabolically expensive to rebuild it from scratch. The brain prefers to update the existing model at the margins rather than demolish and reconstruct. This updating bias has significant consequences in real relationships. Research by psychologists Aronson and Linder found that people are more positively influenced by someone who starts out disliking them and gradually warms up than by someone who simply liked them from the beginning. But they're also more negatively affected by a warm person who gradually grows cold than by someone who is consistently cold throughout. The arc matters because the brain assigns special weight to movement away from its initial model. But the initial model itself, the first impression, still functions as the baseline against which all of that movement is measured. The person who makes a poor first impression and then spends weeks correcting is not simply climbing toward neutral. They are climbing against gravity. What this means practically is that the moments of first encounter carry a weight that most people dramatically underestimate. The handshake, the eye contact, the first sentence, the pace of speech, the angle of posture in the first photograph, the first line of the message. These are not preludes to the real evaluation. They are often the evaluation happening so fast and so automatically that both parties walk away believing they are still forming an opinion. Research on job interviews found that interviewers often make a decisive hire or no hire judgment within the first 4 minutes, and then spend the remaining time unconsciously gathering confirmation for that judgment rather than genuinely gathering information. The rest of that interview is, in a meaningful sense, theater that the interviewer is performing for themselves. Understanding thin slicing and snap judgment does not mean accepting their verdicts as final. It means recognizing that your first impression of a person is a hypothesis formed rapidly from a limited data set, shaped by evolutionary shortcuts that were calibrated for a different world. The verdict arrived in 200 milliseconds. It is not a conclusion. It is a starting point, one that your brain will defend with considerable energy unless you make a deliberate effort to hold it lightly. The way to do that is not to suppress the initial reaction, which is both impossible and counterproductive. It is to treat it as information while remaining curious about where it might be wrong. The people who develop the most accurate social intelligence are not the ones who judge the slowest. They're the ones who judge quickly and then stay curious long enough to find out what they missed. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. Every week, this channel goes one level further into the psychology shaping every encounter you have